later. But here's the reason you're not bothering me. I don't dig it. I got people that dig.
Well, I can be one of the diggers.
So ain't that right?
Ma'am, I like to dig.
She's one time.
What are you doing, sir? Just one time.
Does she know Wayne? I do.
Okay, everyone, let's find our seats. It's 1 p.m. or shortly thereafter. We should get started. I feel like I'm waiting for everybody to come in because everybody's so spread out. This is wild, but we have nearly everybody here. This is crazy. Thank you and welcome. A few little housekeeping items to take care of. First, I want to thank everybody for wearing your masks while we came in. You'll notice I'm not wearing mine, so a couple of rules with this. If you're eating and drinking, you're welcome to take it off. If you're speaking, you're welcome to take it off. One thing that we've recently learned is because the U shape is so big, we are socially distanced. Everybody has their own 6-foot table and a sitting square in the middle of it. So we're all spread apart fairly well. If you feel comfortable to do so, you are welcome to take your mask off while socially distanced. All I ask is that you put your mask back on while getting up and moving around. Everyone at the table is definitely clear to do that if you so choose. Greg, would you like to open anything with the meeting before we get started?
We are now in order. Thank you, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to the July meeting of the Savannah Riverside Citizens Advisory Board, and welcome to my hometown of Augusta. Thank you, CAB members, for your service, your volunteer service to your community, the CAB, and DOE. As you all know, the the Environmental Management Site-Specific Advisory Board mission encompasses 8 sites across the country. So indeed, thank you for your service to our nation as well. Thank you, teams from DOE and other federal agencies, South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control, and SRS contractors. And of course, thank you, James Tanner, and the CAB team for the excellent meeting you put together for us. We'll be conducting a full range of CAB activities today and tomorrow. In particular, we'll be doing a full range of work with recommendations from voting on whether to send 2 draft recommendations to DOE for consideration, as well as voting to close a recommendation that we've received a response from DOE on. Before we start this and other important work, I'd like to acknowledge the resignation of our colleague Dave Vivakis, who provided wonderful service to the CAB for a number of years. I think he actually came on about the same time I did. Dave was always well prepared for meetings and willing to ask important and sometimes difficult questions. So thank you, Dave, if you're watching, for your service. And as a result of this, we've got the great opportunity. I'd like to welcome Katrina Belzer as the new vice chair of the Administration and Outreach Committee. Thank you, Katrina, wherever you are. There she is. This is such a big table. I took a second to track you down. Thank you, Katrina, for being willing to take on this extra service. I was going to mention what James had mentioned about the mask, but I will leave it at that. I will also say in terms of housekeeping, I did hand out a flow chart that talks about the liquid waste generation disposal process. This is completely for your use. Hopefully it's helpful to you. It took me a long time to figure this process out. And I thought, well, maybe it would be helpful for you all to have that as well. So I shared a copy of something I use to work with that may be helpful to you. So again, thank you everybody for your service. If there's anything I can do to help you in any way, please just let me know, and have a great meeting. Thank you, James.
All right. Any questions for Greg before we move on down the agenda? Not that he opened up for questions, but I know he doesn't mind. No? We're good? All right. Then up next, let's move through the DOE updates, or the agency updates, and we'll start with the Department of Energy and Mike Bundy.
Thanks, James. Well, that's a little loud. Huh?
That was a lot at all times.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, very good. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So we'll jump right in here. As we started with COVID, of course, the rules have changed in how you decide whether or not you wear a mask or not. So if you're in a DOE, on a DOE site or facility, and the county in which you're located has a high community transmission rate or a high hospitalization rate, and there's specific numbers associated with that, then you have to wear masks in those DOE facilities, and that's why we've reinstituted masks on site, because Aiken and Barnwell counties are both in those high categories. Hopefully those rates will go back down as they have in the Northeast soon, and we can get back out of the mask, but there we are for now. Return to the budget. Just a reminder, the environmental management portion of the budget is $1.75 billion, so we're in good shape there. SRS overall is about $3 billion. Our request for FY23 with the President's budget is $1.72 billion. And of course, we're already in the throes of starting to develop the FY24 budget as we wait to see how Congress takes care of that FY23 appropriation. We will be setting up a meeting in mid-August to explain the budget for local elected officials in the CSRA, and we'll of course invite CAB members to participate in that meeting too if they so desire. So we'll explain what the FY23 budget request means to us as compared to FY22 budget, and we'll discuss our priorities for FY24, though we can't talk numbers on FY24 at this point. Quick update on contracts. Really nothing new to say about the security contract. We're still working on the corrective action that was required due to the protests from when we attempted to award that contract. Well, when we announced the award of the contract last year.
Thank you.
So that's still ongoing. We did have to issue a notice of intent to extend the current contract with Centera so that we have enough coverage to carry us through until a new contract is awarded. Liquid waste operations, Savannah River mission completion, doing great stuff. Transition went smoothly, and we're working with them now and with our EPA and South Carolina DHEC colleagues on the plan going forward. SRMC's got a lot of initiatives to try to make the process as efficient as possible. And so we got to make sure it aligns with the state and EPA's priorities too, so that we can put together the best program we have to get that liquid waste mission done as efficiently as possible. The management operations acquisition contract. As you know, late last year we announced an indefinite delay to the final request for proposal to re-examine and ensure it's the best possible mission execution, especially in light of NSA's increasing scope at SRS. So with the contract expiring in September, at the end of September this year, as you can imagine, we are working hard on formulating a decision as to how to proceed and work with headquarters on that process. Advanced Manufacturing Collaborative. In April 2020, we awarded the contract. We've gone through the design process. The contractor has provided to us a final design for our review, and we should begin construction here very shortly. We're working through the last few issues with permits, both with the city and the county, so that we're ready to go on that construction. Moving into operations, L area continues to receive spent nuclear fuel shipments, both foreign and domestic reactors. H Canyon continues processing material test reactor and high flux isotope reactor spent nuclear fuels, and they're both on track to meet all their objectives for fiscal year 22. Carrier area is also on track with the plutonium downblend operations and packaging of the material into criticality container overpacks, or CCOs as we call them, for shipment to WIP later this calendar year. Building 235F deactivation, this is a big deal for taking care of a facility that had some significant material in it, plutonium-238 specifically. The facility deactivation activities are on schedule and should complete in early calendar year 2023. And we have requested funding in fiscal year 23 President's budget request to commence the actual D&D planning of finally putting that facility in its final end state. So we should be able to get going on that as soon as the appropriations are put in place for FY23. FNH lab deactivation activities are continuing. As mentioned previously, we consolidated FNH lab over to SRNL in area, and it was a cost savings initiative that allowed us to access the lab, FNH lab, and integrate facility deactivation activities. Transuranic waste shipments to the waste isolation pilot plant. We have completed 11 legacy true waste shipments to date this fiscal year, and expect to execute some more before the year's out. The salt waste processing facility has processed over 921,000 gallons so far in fiscal year 22. We just recently completed a planned outage earlier this month, and SWPF is back in operation. The salt stone production facility continues to operate, and they've produced over 3 million gallons of salt stone and deposited it in the SDUs this fiscal year. Work continues on the salt stone disposal units. As of July 2022, construction of the tank for SDU 8 is complete, and installation of the tank liner is underway. SDU 9, the floor is complete, 22 of 25 walls, and 185 of 208 columns are complete. So great progress on both SDU 8 and 9. And we're starting site prep for SDU 10. We have authority now to commence construction of SDUs 10 through 12. Defense waste processing facility, 39 canisters poured through fiscal year 22, so they're on track with their objectives. 310 canisters have been double stacked in the glass waste storage building 1. So we're up to 675 since the project began in August of 2016. We're in a 2-month outage right now, which should complete by the end of July, and there'll be another 1-month outage later this fall. And the purpose of those outages is to convert from a nitric formic acid system over to glycolic acid. The nitric acid decomposes into compounds in the waste streams that produce hydrogen, and that constrains DWPF production. So this transition to glycolic will reduce the hydrogen production, enable us to operate DWPF at a higher rate to keep up with SWPF. As we were last time, we're still working 15 tanks in various states of preparation to support SWPF and DWPF. And 3 of those tanks are undergoing salt dissolution. So, F-Tank Farm Division boxes 5 and 6. We did complete the grouting in January. Entombment design for both diversion boxes is also complete, and field work has been initiated with bending and staging of rebar for both diversion boxes. We expect to close those out by the end of the calendar year to meet our federal facilities agreement commitment. Over in soil and water cleanup infrastructure and regulatory issues, SRS annual deer hunt. The lottery is now open for people to register, and applications can be found on the srs.gov link or SRS Facebook page. There are 8 hunts scheduled for late November and early December. D&D work in D area, progress continues, and we're D&D of the Sealand containers, handy houses, other small ancillary facilities was completed on June 15th. And the next task order, which began June 23rd, is D&D of the coal handling facilities. The coal handling facilities include 3 multi-story metal buildings, 2 ancillary portable buildings, and hundreds of feet of below and above grade coal conveyance systems. And that work is scheduled to be completed by the end of the fiscal year. I think this was a subject of a brief we gave the board in May. We have submitted 3 sustainability award nominations to DOE headquarters, so we'll see where those go. One was for the Fido remediation project, where we sequester tritium and carbon using a plantation of longleaf pine trees. So to date, we've sequestered about 192 tons of carbon and 7,000 curies of tritium. The second one we submitted for was the completely passive cleanup project in Deer area. Groundwater quality in the shallow aquifer was severely degraded by very low pH, less than 3, leachate from the coal storage facility. So we cleaned the groundwater using a deep artesian well, so it required no pumping. That water being injected into the acidified water table aquifer, flushing it into a down gradient man-made canal, where it's being treated by stationary calcium carbonate reactive structures before flowing into the Beaver Dam Creek. And then we used pulverized limestone and covered it with crushed limestone to remediate the soil. And together, those efforts will provide alkaline leachate to buffer the acid contents of the soil and groundwater. And then the final remediation action for lower 3 runs integrated operable unit was another recommendation we made for an award. So it's a complex system of reactor cooling, water canals, ponds, reservoirs, and lower 3 Runs Creek runs all the way to the mouth of the Savannah River, or to its mouth at the Savannah River. And the selected remedy makes extensive use of access controls and long-term monitoring of radioactive decay to protect human health. And land use controls to prevent access or development will prevent exposure to radioactive media while the radiocesium decays to a level posing no unacceptable risk. So that was a great effort working with our regulator partners to get that finally done. We're also working on river water pump house repairs. We've purchased replacement transformers for the pump house substation through Dominion Energy, and they were delivered to the site in July, on July 8th. We're working on the installation. These are the first large transformers to be replaced SRS since 1992. They're right sized to more efficiently meet the current forecasted power loads and over twice the size of the 70-year-old transformers being replaced. It's part of a $5 million recapitalization project to upgrade the river water pump house electric power system, become more efficient and reliable. That pump house is critical site operations. It provides the water to the biomass cogeneration facility run by Amoresco that produces steam, and that steam in turn enables H Canyon, DWPF, Tritium, and Tank Farm to run their processes. We still use, the pumps that were installed originally back in the 1950s are still there for use, along with some smaller pumps. But the electrical system supporting those was aged beyond repair. So this is a big deal to get the transformers replaced and replace all the electrical switchgear that's in there. The pump house also provides key water to keep Par Pond and L Lake at the required levels so that contaminated sediments remain covered. And that project is scheduled to be complete in early fiscal year 24. I'm going to hold off on the Savannah River National Lab because you have updates for that, I understand, tomorrow. So that concludes my prepared remarks. Happy to answer any questions you may have.
Any questions for Mike? Jim, let's start with you.
We were supposed to receive a presentation on the status of that project, but the presentation was pulled. Can you bring us up to date as to what's going on and what we might be seeing in the future?
Yeah, we're talking to headquarters about when we might be able to provide that presentation. I think we're passing out an article that was in the Rad Waste Monitor? EM update. EM update. There's an EM update on the ABD. The project was approved to go ahead and change the way we operate the canyon so that we can accelerate processing of the material in L Basin. Of course, being able to execute that will be subject to appropriations, so we'll see how that process goes. It's not the highest priority we have. Obviously, liquid waste is the highest priority we have, so we need to make sure that's fully funded. And so we'll see where we can get on that.
Thank you.
But we do have authority to proceed.
I have one more question.
Mm-hmm.
And this pertains to a report that was issued in May that started between March and May of 2020, the Office of Environmental Safety and Health Assessments which is an office within the Office of Enterprise Assessments, conducted a review of condition reports created between January 1, 2018 and February 29, 2020. The Office of the Inspector General conducted a review of this evaluation. There's a report, DOE OIG 22-32, which was issued in May of this year. The assessment identified 4 findings within 13 instances, findings being defined as deficiencies that warrant a high level of attention by management. These findings broke down as follows: 6 instances where there was a failure to fully address findings and deficiencies, 3 times failure to document within IMS, 2 times corrective action incorrectly documented, and 2 times corrective action plan not created. The question is, how are these issues, deficiencies, incorporated in the process by which award fees are determined? Can you give us a little insight into that?
Yeah, of course, we take a look at all this stuff that where there are deficiencies, and there are varying degrees of how significant they are, but we look at all those things as we're working on award fees to calculate where they fit in the scheme, and we give the contractor feedback on a month-to-month basis, written feedback on the issues that could affect their award fee for that year. So they're all factored in as we go. We also have upgraded the way we track those deficiencies to make sure they're completed in a timely manner, because part of the view is that while deficiencies occur, it's even more important that when they, not so much the specific deficiencies, we take immediate corrective action to fix that, but what we really want to make sure we got right is the long-term corrective action, so that those things don't recur, or that we don't have an extended condition where they might occur somewhere else on the site. So we don't want to just fix the problem, over here in this area and have people doing the same thing somewhere else. A couple things we've done. We've, our managers are tracking better the correction of those deficiencies in the formal system we already had set up for that. In addition, we do quarterly briefs to headquarters on the status of the operation, and I require that any findings that require corrective action, we include the status of those in those quarterly briefs to headquarters, so we don't lose track of any of them, and make sure they get closed out. So, yeah, we take them all into consideration.
Okay, thank you.
Candace.
What can you tell us about the recent spill?
Well, we had a recent spill. I don't mean to joke about it because it's a pretty serious issue. We haven't had one like that in quite some time, and so we're taking a very hard look at exactly what occurred, the specifics of that particular incident, and again, the extended condition. Do we have other conditions like that anywhere else on the site where such a thing could happen? The response to the spill was excellent by the contractor. As soon as they recognized something had happened, they sequestered the area and made sure that the spill didn't get spread any farther than it already had. And they're working hard on the remediation plan, which I expect to get briefed on here shortly. The investigation into actually what occurred and why it occurred is still in progress. So I don't want to jump to conclusions there. But we're looking at the whole thing of whether it was a material failure. Did we have the system not well designed? Were there failure to follow procedures? We look at the whole gamut to figure out exactly what occurred. And again, most importantly, hey, what's the long-term corrective action? Because usually when you have a condition like this, the long-term correction has to be something that will still exist when all the people who were there today are gone. So if it's a process, you got to fix that process in writing somewhere so it exists long-term. can't just do one-time training and have it be corrected. If it's a material thing, we got to fix the material issue, but often it turns out to be a combination of things between whatever procedure you had and procedural compliance. So we'll see when we get the final analysis, but investigation's underway.
Thank you.
Any other questions around the table? Charles?
Thank you, Mr. Budney. I always learn from your presentation. I heard you say today that water is being pumped to Parr Pond and Ale Lake to maintain the levels. Never thought about that. Those were man-made lakes for the cooling water, I believe.
Right.
What's the long-term plan to maintain? Will we always have to pump water up there, or how do we solve this? That's a lot of energy cost, I would think.
I don't want to speak out of turn here. I think one of those lakes we have to pump on a regular basis and one not so much. We should get back to you on that one, exactly what that long-term plan. You know, I imagine it may not be a forever thing as far as any contaminants. It depends on what it's contaminated with. You know, if it was radioactive material, all that stuff decays. Most of our stuff that we worry about is cesium, so it's got a 30-year half-life, so that's not a forever issue. But I'd have to get back to exactly. I think we got I was told at one point that there's some mercury in there too. So, but I don't want to theorize on that. Let me get back to you with we can shoot that at a future CAB meeting, and we can get back to exactly what the long-term schedule is for those. But we do have to maintain them at the current rate, current time, and it requires us to maintain the dams also that are associated with those lakes to make sure they're in good working order. So we do that in accordance with, just like anybody else has to maintain a dam that's built for a reservoir.
Charles?
I do
you
have
got
another
more?
question on another issue. You told us that the salt waste processing facility had come back up after the shutdown, and I think there were some process problems or something in it that had to be fixed. When you say it came back up, at what rate did it come back? And if you can give me an annual rate, is that the 4 million gallons a year rate, or the 6 million, or the 9 million, or has that been determined yet?
Yeah, we're operating a bit over the 4 million gallon rate per year right now. Yeah, we've had it operating at about a 6 million gallon rate, but we're currently running at about 4 million gallons. We have a number of initiatives we have to take. As we said before, we have this issue of material clogging some of the filters that we have in that system. And so SRMC's got a stepwise program to institute some different activities to try to sort out that chemistry issue and reduce the clogging of those filters so that we can maintain a rate going forward. So.
Thank you, sir.
Any other questions from around the table? Usually I make a joke about giving him the easy ones, but some of those were actually kind of difficult today, so I'll abstain. You sure? Nothing else? Mr. Budney, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Jim.
Let's move on down the agenda to EPA. John, you ready?
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, John Richards in Region 4, Atlanta, although we're in our regional office. Talking to Mike earlier, we're still on a remote basis because of a little garment issue in the largest building in downtown Atlanta, or the largest building in Southeast, actually. But our travel schedule is back to normal, and so we've been going to plenty of meetings, Savannah River, also over a lot of Oak Ridge projects as well, so glad that is happening. Some of these you know about. I'll just mention quickly, the lower three runs is one of our big success stories, getting a earlier remedial action decision last fall. I think it was scheduled January. We had it done, I think, November. And I think Brian's doing a talk on that tomorrow, so I will not say anything more about that. Rob Pope, as you may recall, some of you that have been on here a while, he's still the lead for that project. And he and our new colleague, Jana Dawson, who's one of our contractors for many, many years, are the co-leads for our tank, I'll always tank project, and then I'm over them as the FFA. So we, I think, have had some very successful early meetings with Savannah River Site, South Carolina on the new tank negotiations, trying to iron out details. And what's very important for EPA is, and you'll hear a lot of this in my talk tomorrow that some of you have heard before, but getting CERCLA Superfund milestones is very important, not just for our regional office and our headquarters, but and it helps us show that we're doing our part in getting the site cleaned up. So again, tanks sometimes are different than a lot of the things we do in the soil and groundwater, but I know Rob Pope was very instrumental in getting some milestones where we were before the suspension of the agreement, and we're hoping that'll continue with the new negotiation. So I think we have another meeting coming up in Columbia in a couple weeks. The only other thing I had, as I think some of you know, and this will be in my talk too, but we do annual 5-year reviews. That means any project that's been completed that may be undergoing land use controls, maybe some types of groundwater monitoring. For a normal Superfund site, that's usually one operable unit, and they look at it every 5 years. But Savannah Riverside is so large that we actually, instead of doing a whole bunch in every 5 years, we actually break them up depending on the type of remedy every year. So we're just finished, and I'm finishing comments, and everything looks good for the geosynthetic system, the one we will work on this past year, which involves maybe 10 or 12 type different remedies at different sites. And I just forgot, they just got issued the one that'll start off, really, I think we kick off that one in December. We've already got some preliminary info on the next 5-year review. So no surprises, any of those. Been good for us as well. I think that's all I have. Thank you.
Any questions for EPA? That's okay. Y'all get another chance tomorrow.
Oh, I have one more.
Okay.
We've recently had, I think since the last meeting, we've had one EJ meeting. Now I'm just trying to remember the name of the church we had it at. I think that was in mid-June, I want to say.
In Williston, South Carolina.
Yeah. And then we recently just did a treat workshop at the community college down in Waynesboro. That was the first week of July. So they would give talks at both of those, and at the earlier one, we had one of our contractors there as well. So I think those were all both successfully, had a large turnout for both. We're very appreciative of that. Thanks to Lisa, too, for all she does. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions or comments for EPA? All right. Up next, we'll move over to DHEC. Your agenda says Susan Fulmer, and that is a lie. Susan is not able to be here today. Instead, we have Heather Cathcart. You ready, Heather?
Yes, I am.
Let's go.
Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, I'll give you a quick agency update. Over the past year, DHEC has worked with teams across the agency as well as external partners to undertake a review of the current structure and function of DHEC and identifying areas for possible improvement as well as those areas that are functioning well. The goals of the review are to improve service to the people of South Carolina, enhance effectiveness and efficiency consistent with our mission and vision, prepare for the future of health and environmental protection in our state, and increase collaboration across the agency with our external partners. And as a result of this review, several proposed improvements were identified. On July 21st, 2022, our DHEC director, Dr. Simmer, announced proposed key operational changes aimed at improving customer service and delivery. These proposed changes will be submitted to the DHEC board for approval at the next board meeting on August 11th, 2022. As far as our FFA program, the core team met on May 23rd to continue discussions on the proposed remedial actions and regulatory strategy for the remaining ash and coal fines OUs at SRS, focusing on the F area ash landfill. And as John mentioned, we have been meeting for liquid waste, and since the CAB meeting, DHEC, EPA, DOE, and SRMC held 2 large meetings to renegotiate the liquid waste milestones. We also formed several breakout groups to focus on specific issues and make good progress in our discussions. This is an all-in effort involving multiple program areas and levels of management. We appreciate the efforts of DOE, SRMC, and EPA to reach a common understanding of the intricacies of the liquid waste program and to come to a mutual satisfactory set of milestones. Are there any questions?
Questions or comments for DHEC around the table? Charles?
I'm not sure this is fair, but in one of the environmental updates that we got, I noticed that there was a hearing scheduled to receive the USS Enterprise's reactor vessels. Thought that was kind of neat. Are they going to just bury those where? Is that in the landfill, county landfill, or?
I am not able to answer that question. I'm not sure I know anything about that at the moment.
I just
But
thought
I
it,
can look into it and try to figure it out and let you know.
thank you. I thought you thought it was kind of neat.
Reactors, big ships, it ticks all your boxes.
Those reactors are probably bigger than Mr. Budney's submarines.
All right, any other questions or comments for DHEC? All right, that being the case, let's move on down the road. Let's go into the committee updates. We'll give each chair a brief moment to talk about what they've been working on, give us an idea of where they stand with everything. We'll start with A&O. Bobby?
Good afternoon, all, and welcome to Augusta. Since our last full board meeting, the A&O committee has not had any activities. And the only one thing we've had new since the last meeting was with the resignation of Dave Bavakis. Katrina Belsa has volunteered to serve as vice chair of the A&O committee. Thank you, Katrina. That's all I have to report.
Okay. Any questions for A&O before we move on? All right. Facilities. Narinder, do you have anything to talk about today?
Narendra Malakab. For facility disposition and site remediation, we have nothing new to mention. Other than that, we'll be talking about one of the recommendations, discussing this afternoon.
Okay. Any questions for facilities? All right, we'll go to nuclear materials. Jim?
Jim Gill, Cap. We did not meet last month because we were waiting for the L Basin presentation. Hopefully we'll pick that up. In the meantime, we have a couple of recommendations that we'll be looking at, and hopefully we'll have one today we can push through. Other than that, no immediate activity in nuclear materials.
Okay. Any questions for the nuclear materials committee? All right. Candace, any updates from waste management?
The Waste Management Subcommittee last met on June 21st. We had a great informative meeting. We are currently working on 2 proposals, 2 recommendations. That's all the activity we had.
You scared me for a second there. I asked you if you had any updates, and I saw your head go, and I thought, oh, she's going to just say no and stop. Any questions for waste management? Okay. Any questions or comments about the tour that some folks went on last week? Does anybody want to talk about that briefly before we move on down the agenda? Charles, do you? Yeah, I saw you reaching.
I don't know who puts the tours together, but a huge thank you to whoever did it. James, I don't know if you do it, Delisa, Amy, Mr. Budney, I don't know who
I'll
puts
tell you who in this room played the biggest role, and we don't hear from her a whole lot. It's Kristen Huber, who's sitting way in the back and waving her hand, like real low in the air. Like, I want some credit, but not a lot low. But like, if she were to wave it higher, that would be her. And you know, as much praise as y'all give me for that, usually all I do is say, hey, Kristen, they want to go on a tour, and then it happens. So.
Well, many thanks for that tour. I've been on this 4 or 5 years. I think I've been on every tour that's been made available, but possibly one. This was an excellent tour. I saw new things. We got into the salt waste processing facility. We actually got to go in it, and all over H Canyon again. It was a good tour. If you didn't get to go on it, you missed a good one. So thank you for everybody that was involved. Thank you, Mr. Budney, for allowing us to come on the site and seeing everything. It was a good tour.
All right. Any other questions and comments before we move on? Okay. I'm showing 1:40, which is a little bit earlier than we really intended to take a break, but I'm going to suggest we do it anyway. Let's come back at 1:55. We'll be back in our seats, and we'll move on with the rest of our agenda. Give you a chance to stretch your legs a bit before we go into presentations. 1:55, please. Thank you.
Okay, maybe.
All right, folks, let's find our seats. Time to get started. A little past time to get started. I'm 2 minutes late. Of course, we got the time. Get all the good kids on this side of the room. You got your seats. You know what you're doing. Sure.
With that tour that took place, with a number of us not being able to, when will they have another tour?
I don't know when we'll be able to do another one, yeah.
But I knew about DWF, so I didn't really worry about that, but I would like to go and look at it from a different perspective.
All right, folks. Have we found our seats? All right. Up next, we have a presentation from archaeology. The big difference is, you remember a meeting or so ago, we had the curation facility folks out. They talked about historic preservation. That was Cold War to now. He's got everything prior to that. A lot more than that.
Oh. Yay, buddy.
Are we ready? Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me here today speaking. It's been quite a while since I've spoken in front of a group. I'm usually a sporadic kind of speaker, and I'm kind of like this all the time. I haven't spoken since January of 2020 to a group, so I'm not sure if you're going to get even more of this today or you're going to see a train wreck, but it's going to be interesting what we see here today. A friend of mine said, it's kind of like riding a bicycle, Do I look like I ride a lot of bicycles? I don't, but I think we can get through this. My name is George Wingard. I'm with the Savannah River Archaeological Research Program. One of the main things to remind everyone, we do not dig dinosaurs. Now, Vogel's got one, so I'm really jealous about the fact that they've got one over there, but we're not going to bring in what Vogel has. But we do not do dinosaurs. That's paleontologists. We basically do the same type of job. We dig little things and we save it, but maybe one day we'll be lucky and find something out there a little bit older than what we do deal with. Some of the fine print, like when you buy a car, let's get through the fine print really quick here. The Savannah River Archaeological Research Program is a division of the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology, and we're located on the University of South Carolina. We manage the archaeological and other historic resources for the United States Department of Energy. What is archaeology? Archaeology is a study of the scientific study of people from the past through the things they make and use. As James mentioned, we have a lot of history out on site, nearly 13,000 years of history, everything from the Paleo people, through the Archaic people, through the Woodland people, through the Mississippian people. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that a little bit later, and if you have any questions. But, a lot of people, one of the first things I just kind of want to get out, a lot of people want to ask, what tribes were on site? Well, we didn't necessarily have any tribes on site. And historically, what we find is during the DeSoto period and onwards, it was kind of a barren zone. So we have no tribe affiliation whatsoever on the Savannah River site. So just kind of answer that question right up front in case anybody has that a little bit later. As a result of the federal and state laws and regulations, the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology began in 1973 a phased approach to archaeological compliance involving reconnaissance surveys, general intensive watershed surveys, specific intensive surveys, data recovery, and coordination with major land users on and around the Savannah River site. Basically what that means is that we weren't needed on site. Somebody said, hey, why don't you come out here and start looking at the archaeology? Now, a little bit later, what happened, we have the Antiquities Act of 1906, and then we have 36 CFR Section 106 of the Archaeological Resource Management, which says, hey, archaeological and historical research must be done on federal property. So about that time is when we were kind of asked to come on. So we've been on site since 73, full-time since 1973, so we're about to celebrate our 50th anniversary on site. We became a program in 1978. So we have two anniversaries, a 50th and a 45th. What do we do? So let's get to the fun stuff here, all the small prints out of the way. What do? We have a threefold mission for the U.S. DOE. Cultural resource management. As I said earlier, 13,000 years of history on site. All of those Native American periods that I mentioned before, the antebellum, the postbellum, the early 20th century. We handle everything up to 1950. Now, I think last month y'all had Miss Linda Smith come in and speak to you about, some of the things that they're curating. So we both organizations work together. We handle everything up to 1950, which of course is the former communities that were on site. We had Ellington and Dunbarton, Myers Mill. Nearly 6,000 people were displaced when the Atomic Energy Commission announced on November 28, 1950, that the area had been chosen for the building of the Savannah River Project, Savannah River Plant, Savannah River Site as we know it today. Research, USDOE allows us to do research on these different aspects of the cultural history on site, helps us better understand what we're dealing with, doing that research. You just kind of go out and say, we found this and it's the end of it. You need a little bit more to help protect that. So by doing the research, learning about what's out there helps us to better, again, understand it, better protect it. And then finally, our third-fold mission is education. We go out, disseminate what we found to the public, i.e. meetings like this. We do a lot of, we go to churches and fall field days and things like that. Pre-COVID, we were going into the schools on a quite regular basis. That's kind of slowed down a little bit, obviously, since COVID. We do have our new outreach coordinator, Ms. Haley Milner, who's back here in the back. We're out doing weekend festivals. We were just at the Juneteenth Festival in Aiken. Seed Day will be coming up soon at Aiken, USC Aiken. She's working up a plan to get into the schools via the internet, via email, to help teach archaeology, and then on a invitation basis can go into the schools and talk about what we do, the importance of archaeology, why we do it, and so forth. I think I just said all of this. The primary mission of the SRP is to ensure that the Department of Energy remains compliance with the federal laws regarding archaeological and other cultural resources. To that end, the SRP conducts regular surveys throughout the Savannah River site. We work closely with the United States Forest Service on site. They do a lot of work, obviously, with their logging activities. So we work hand in hand with them on a daily basis because they're the biggest land user on site. They're making the biggest impacts on a daily basis. So we're on site every day. We comply with existing historic preservation laws and do so with little or no impact to planned projects. So, by working with the historic laws and working with the different contractors, we can all work together to facilitate the protection of the cultural resources on site. So, just a few fun photos here of what we do here. This is actually a project that we were working off-site, but it kind of just shows you some of the tools we're dealing with. The top left corner is a transit, and we dig a lot of the square holes, which of course you've seen probably on the history channels, things like that. We go into an area. Once you dig these holes, pull everything out, that history's lost. So we have to be very meticulous in what we do in our excavations to protect that history. A lot of photographs, a lot of maps, because again, once it comes out of the ground, you've lost that context. A lot of people, when you have an artifact, you want to know the context of where it came from. If you just, have an artifact or you buy one online, you don't know what that context is. You may have that artifact, but you don't know where it came from. You don't know its provenance. So what we do on site is to ensure that our 2.5 million artifacts, some of you who were at the curation facility the other day saw what we have, 2.5 million artifacts. We know where every artifact came and from what point on site. The artifacts, once they're dug, they go through the screening process. Again, kind of a meticulous process. All the soil is screened through 1/4-inch screens or 1/8-inch screens. Those artifacts are brought back to our office, washed and analyzed. Research is done on them. They're bagged and tagged and protected. Again, this is every day what we do. And I'm going to tell you in a moment how we go out. I'll tell you the process by which we go into the field on a daily basis. Again, this was an off-site project, part of research. We were working in Graniteville. We had been asked to do some work in Graniteville, and we went over to help do a little bit of research over there, which was interesting because we were working behind the Graniteville Mill. If you don't know anything about the Graniteville Mill, they had a mill village, they had houses. This is where we were working, doing research. On site, we have a former community called the Lee community. Lee was part of the Lee Banana Case Company, the largest employer on site in 1950. And so by working in Graniteville, we could take what we learned there and bring it back. So when the Forest Service says, we're going to do some work down in Lee, we're going to do some work near the Lee Banana Case Company, we can go, okay, we can extrapolate what we've done in Graniteville to come back and more quickly assess what would be need to do along in the Lee area, in which we actually did that just a couple of years ago, something for Forest Service. So we were able to utilize the research we had done in Graniteville to help us better protect Lee on site. Our daily field work, pedestrian or shovel test surveys to identify archaeological sites. It could also involve large-scale excavation. So, what we do is we go out into an area, we're called to go to an area, say, for example, along one of the drainages. Let's say, Lower Three Runs. They want to put a monitoring well on Lower Three Runs. There will be a high probability of Native American artifacts there. That's what they needed. Native Americans needed water. This is where the animals came to feed and get water and whatnot. So you're going to find a high probability of Native American artifacts in an area like that. So we'll go to the area and we'll begin a systematic shovel testing grid looking for these artifacts. And believe it or not, we're going to find more. We're going to find them more often than not just because of where we're digging. We'll get those artifacts. It helps us delineate what eventually will become the full size of the site that the Native Americans would have been living in and working and camping in. Sometimes these turn into large excavations. Off to the right here, your photo is of the George Bush Plantation. No relation to either of our former presidents that we can completely identify, but we worked on that for a while. George Bush Plantation was going to be impacted by the Three Rivers landfill. So we were able to go in, do some work there, find out a lot of information about George Bush Plantation, which we wrote up in a book called Plantations Without Pillars. You can certainly find that on our website as a PDF and download that and read that journal that we all came together and wrote and put images and maps in. And at the end of this, you'll see those places where you can go and find all the links to the things that I'm mentioning. Again, careful excavation techniques. Digging the units, again, measuring. Everything is meticulously measured. That's a brick pile in the center there from the George Bush Plantation. Every brick. What happened was this was a two-story home with a fireplace on either end. And eventually what happened is that building had burned, the house had burned around 1900, and the two fireplaces fell in on each other and really protected a lot what was beneath it, around it. And we learned that, we learned a lot from that excavation as to what was going on in that house. Basically, prior to its burning, it had been a hunting lodge. The use of it as a plantation had long been over. It was used as a hunting lodge to a point where they were taking old churns and things like that and apparently just tossing them out the window and shooting them. So we found a lot of broken churns that we had to go through. And yes, we did move every one of those bricks to get to the bottom to see what was beneath it. And the picture to your right up there, two gentlemen up there screening, using water to screen the artifacts. And yes, that is half of me in the left of that picture up there. So that was a long time ago.
Buddy, this is Amy. Can I ask
Yes,
a quick question?
sure.
I know you said when you started that there weren't any tribes on site.
Yes.
But now you're talking about Native American artifacts and what was found near the creek. Can you explain to me?
So when I fall back into the term Native American, I'm talking about that generic term for the prehistoric Native Americans.
Okay,
Paleo people, woodland people, the paleo people, the archaic, the woodland. Paleo people is about 13,000 years ago to about 8,000 years ago.
Okay.
The archaic period is about 8,000 to about 5,000. Woodland period, about 5,000 to about, woodland period 5,000 or 5,000 to about 100, about 1,000 AD, somewhere around in there. And then you pick up the Mississippian period, which leads you up to about 1,500 or so. So those are the periods. So when I talk Native Americans, I mean that's what I'm referring to. So yeah, no problem. So again, just some of what we do: screening of artifacts, mapping. Again, I've mentioned a lot of that's what we do. One of our newest toys we have on site is ground penetrating radar. You can see in the upper picture there, it looks like a baby carriage with a little antenna on the bottom. We can pull that over an area. It helps us see disturbances in the soil. A lot of people, if you've watched CSI, they roll it over an area and a skeleton. They can see a skeleton. That's not true. You can't do that. That's great for television, but it's not reality. What you do is with ground penetrating radar, for example, if you were looking at a cemetery, you would begin to hopefully see a pattern of, like a systematic pattern of the soil disturbances of the same depth and length, which kind of says, okay, that's a cemetery, that's a plot. You see enough of those in a row, you begin to go, okay, this was a cemetery. You see one off by itself near maybe a road, then you kind of go, is this a hole? Was this a plot? That's where you have to kind of start, mapping and making decisions as to whether what you're seeing is not just a hole where a tree fell over. So there's still a lot of guesswork. It's always best to still put the shovel in the ground when you can. I'm not saying go dig up a cemetery by any means, and we don't do that. But, ground penetrating radar does allow us to not have to subsurface test in a lot of instances, especially when it comes to the cemeteries that we still have on site. There were 160 cemeteries on site in 1950. Along with the 6,000 people that had to be displaced with the building of the site. About 130 of our cemeteries were moved, and we have approximately 700 individuals still on site. So work like this helps us to protect those cemeteries. This particular cemetery we're working on here was in Graniteville, again, as part of that project I'll mention to you. This is at, is any of you, just as a sidebar, any of you been to the Graniteville Cemetery? Anybody ever been up there? We got one, I've got a couple here, got a few. This is just a complete sidebar because I find this fascinating. Right here, what you see the two ladies working, behind them is the monument to William Gregg. William Gregg is the man who built Graniteville. He's the one who started the textile mills. And that's his monument standing there. Mr. Gregg died in 1867. Mr. Gregg dies. His wife, Marina, has a marble monument built to him. It was made in Charleston. It was shipped by train from Charleston all the way to Graniteville at the bottom of the hill where that cemetery is. And they hauled that great big monument up to the top of the hill and placed it where you see it right here. Well, about 10 years later, their son died. He was buried in Magnolia Cemetery over in Augusta. And Marina says, heck with this, I'm going back to Charleston. So she took William with her, but she also took the monument. So she takes the monument, they take it back down the hill, put it back on a train, take it all the way back to Charleston, stand it up in Charleston. Well, in the 1920s, Gregg's daughter says, Dad would want to be buried in Graniteville. So they pick up the monument yet again. Now they leave Gregg this time in Charleston, but they bring his monument. They bring it all the way back to Graniteville, bring it all the way back to the bottom of the hill, take it all the way back to the top of the hill, and you can see Gregg's monument there today. So it's traveled across the state 4 times, back and forth. So interesting side note. See, told you, this train wreck, you don't know where this is going to end up today. LIDAR, this is done by airplane. We're getting a lot more of this type of research also that's available to us. So we've got a lot of this information for big portions of Aiken County, Barnwell County, some for Allendale, and we've also got some of this on site through some of our on-site LIDAR departments who's allowed us to see this. And it's amazing when they fly over, all those trees disappear. Everything disappears. And you can see colonial and antebellum roads that are still there in the woods. You can see wells that were built, that were made for these farms, and they're just little holes that go down in the ground. LIDAR picks all this stuff because it sends the radar pulse to the ground and bounces off and comes back up. So in the case of these wells, it bounces down to the bottom of the wells and comes back up, and you have a map and you can find wells scattered around sites. So we try to go out with Forest Service. We fill those back in with rocks because obviously we don't want any of our Forest Service folks or any of our animals to fall in. So, and again, it helps the cultural resource management, the roads, the old dams that were out there, things like that. And that just kind of shows you an overlay of of some of the, what LADAR sees, and then they can just kind of come in and just strip all those trees off. Artifacts come in, they're washed, bagged, and tagged. That's some of our artifacts being washed. Historic artifacts in this case. Some of the artifacts we found, this is a artillery button from the Civil War. On the back of it, Hammond and Turner and Bates. They were a factory in Birmingham, offices in Manchester, England, and they produced high-quality buttons for the Confederacy. So a Confederacy button that we found. Some clay marbles that we have found on site. What do you think this is? Part of a gun, the trigger for a gun? It's actually a toy gun. It wasn't a real gun. It was a toy gun. Probably something dating from the 40s. A Roy Rogers gun or Lone Ranger or something like that. So again, the dissemination of information. So now we've done all this work, all this research, this compliance, everything. We got to disseminate information. So now we start down. We start drawing all the data. We start writing papers, and we do presentations. So that's what we're working on here, writing papers, presentations. And we've written a few books over the years. Again, you can find these. You go to our website, and that'll be on screen in a moment. You go to our website, you can download these. But we've got manuals on and technical reports, prehistoric work we've done, the historic work we've done on site. We've got all these that can be downloaded. And of course, we do an annual report every year to DOE. So we'll start work on our FY22 report in the next month or so. Protecting the cultural heritage. So how do we go out and do this? What prompts us to go this? On site, we have a system called the site use system. And what this does is one of the contractors, as y'all know, we've got numerous contractors on site. So a contractor will say, okay, they'll write up a scope of work, and all the other contractors will look at that scope of work. So for example, one of the contractors may say, I'm going to put a stop sign in the parking lot at 700 building. Okay? Archaeologically, we get that report and we go, hey, that's fine with us. You want to put a stop sign there? Concur. We're good. Now, another report may come through, as I mentioned earlier, and they'll say, we're going to put a monitoring well on lower 3 runs. Well, there's going to be a high probability for cultural resources there. So we send in a comment and say, wait, we've got to go look at this. We've got to go survey this area prior to that work being done. Now remember, it's not just us. There's all the other contractors are looking at this. SRS and DHEC and roads and maintenance. All the other groups are looking at these same reports, sending in their comments on the scopes of work and what can and can't be done and what needs to be done prior to the ground disturbing activities on site. Timber compartment surveys, again, thousands of acres. We survey thousands of acres every year for the U.S. Forest Service for both their logging and their planning activities. Curation. This photo is a little old. Y'all were there recently. We have 2.5 million artifacts in our curation facility. Most of these artifacts are broken glass, rusty nails, chips from church chips from stone tool making by Native Americans. So not a lot of the glamorous stuff like some of you saw over in the Cold War side, but as I always like to say, it's quantity over quality. That's what I say. So we've got a few more artifacts than they do. I do like their metal doors. Y'all saw who was there? You saw their metal doors. I love their metal doors, which probably weighs as much as our entire collection combined. So. Again, research. Some of our research on site. Carolina Bay research. We do a lot of research with the Ecology Lab and with the U.S. Forest Service. A few years ago, Ecology Lab was unblocking some of the drainages put in by the farmers back in the late 19th, early 20th century. So this is just one of our larger bays on site called Flamingo Bay. No one knows why it got the name Flamingo Bay, but that's Flamingo Bay. Native Americans would utilize these. They would, live around them. Much like the drainages, this is where animals would come because there would be standing water. So it was an easy place to live and camp and stay for longer periods of time as the animals were coming in as their food source. Mississippian Project, as I mentioned earlier, 81,000 to about 1,600. You had farmers, hunters, collectors. At this period, the Mississippian period, what you really got is you got these large areas where they're no longer going out camping. They're building basically little kingdoms. They're building palisades around their villages, and they're staying years and years and years, and they'd have a king. And so this is where you really start getting a finesse to what we're finding as far as the pottery. You can see some of the pieces are really kind of ornate there. We do have a few smaller Mississippian sites on the SRS because the 4 larger Mississippian sites were, as I like to say, kind of off-site. You had one on either side of the river, just north and just south of the site. So no large-scale Mississippian camp that we know of was ever on the SRS. That being said, there is evidence there may have been one where the drainage down near TNX on the river in that area, when all that was being constructed, there is evidence that there may have been one there at that time when that area was being constructed in the 50s and prior to the National, the Historic Preservation Act. So unfortunately, we may have lost one in the 50s. Off-site, a colonial period site, the Bartley site. A lot of Swiss immigrants settled in that area. How am I doing on time? I'm good? Okay, just want to make sure. A lot of colonials in our area. The Swiss would settle here. So this is when you start kind of getting the hint of the Native American tribes per se. Not on the SRS, but what was happening was you had, Charleston did not want to be attacked by the Native Americans. You had Augusta didn't want to be attacked by the Native Americans. So they were giving large pieces of property to folks like the Swiss and said, hey, y'all come in, we're going to give you all this we're going to give you all this property, y'all live here, build your communities. So we got large Swiss immigrants over in Beach Island. Well, basically what they were doing, they were putting the Swiss there as the buffer between them and the Native Americans. So the Native Americans are going to come in to attack or whatever. They were going to hit the Swiss first. So the Swiss could then get word to the English down on the coast. So they were kind of like buffer zones is what was happening so with all these immigrants coming in. Miss Catherine Brown, one of the earliest female landowners on site, and actually owned a business, as it says here, a cow pen. She had property on site, and she, some of the other farmers would bring their cattle to her where they were, butchered and whatnot, so they didn't have to. So she was one of the earliest landowners and a working lady on site. Her farm was unfortunately burnt around the 1770s, right at the beginning of the War for Independence. Some of the British kind of slipped through and burned her farm. Again, this is a report that we do have on site that you can download. And as I mentioned earlier, the 19th century bush plantation, that's a photo, kind of a drawing of the house there on the bottom left, and the excavation at the top once we had completed the excavation. And some of our books we've written. So a few years ago, we started making short videos and films to put online. Especially during COVID, we started doing some videos of specific artifacts in our collection. But prior to that, we had begun doing some longer films, which for the most part does dovetail again with the research on site. You can go online and find all of those. We do have the Facebook page, Savannah River Archaeological Research Program. Our website is srarp.org, O-R-G, and you can find all of these also on the website. We've done a few films. One we've done is on Dave the Potter. We've done one on a community called Hawthorne. A lot of folks have not heard of that little community. It was actually displaced in the early 1920s, so prior to the coming of the site. And just some of our other films. We're up to 10 films now that we have done in-house. Volunteering, we have some volunteers that comes out on a regular basis. And Miss Raina O'Brien, you said you wanted to volunteer for us, right? Yeah. So if any of you want to come out, we're doing some excavations over in the Audubon property. So hopefully we can get word out on that if any of you would like to come out. Again, as you notice, I probably don't do as much digging as I used to, but I've got folks who are willing to do it. I don't mind watching it being done, I can promise you that. Some of our exhibits, we go out, public tours, public digs, And we used to go into classrooms. We put this up here because we're certainly hoping to start that again. Classroom digs where we go in and would set up a dig in the classroom and all the measuring, XY axis, things like that. A lot of math. And as you can tell, this is a little bit older slide. We'll be celebrating 40 years of cultural resource management in 2018. Obviously, I forgot to change that slide. So coming up on 45 years. There's a few of our links here. So I did bring one artifact today. I thought I would share it with you. I believe the idea being is that after I speak, there'll be some questions and y'all got a little something else going on. So I'll probably just leave this on the table, and for those of you who want to come up and see it. But I have brought one of Dave's jars. Some of you have seen this before, but I have brought one of Dave's jars. Really quick, who was Dave? Dave was an enslaved individual from Edgefield, South Carolina. What is really important about Dave's story is he knew how to read and write. He could write on his jars. He was a master potter. These jars, for the most part, are only going to be seen in private collections, if you're lucky to know someone, or in museums. This is the only jar that was ever found in an archaeological context. It was found on the Savannah River site, close to the 350, actually close to the Curation Building, where you all came and visited last week. So where we found it. Dave was born about 1801, disappears from the records mid-1870s. Really don't know what happened to him. More than likely he passed away. But he knew how to read and write. This particular jar, he signed Dave on it. April 16th, 1862 is the date of this particular jar. He would write poems on some of his jars. He would write things like, "Oh, moon and stars, it's hard work to make big jars." He would write, one of the most poignant I've always thought was he wrote in 1858, I believe was the date. He wrote, "The 4th of July has surely come to blow the fife and beat the drum." So Dave is talking about the independence of America from Britain. But Dave himself was still not independent. He himself was a slave. So I've always thought that was one of the most poignant that he would write, he had wrote. But again, the only one found in an archaeological context. We're proud that we have it on the Savannah River site where we can take it out and show folks, talk about Dave's legacy. We did do a film called Discovering Dave, Spirit Captured in Clay, which again, you can find either on our website or our Facebook page. But how am I doing? Good with time? Okay. So I think I've rattled on enough because I could go on for hours, but y'all probably don't want that. So questions? You want to do questions? Any questions?
Start with, we'll go over you. Go ahead.
Yes, you can start Monday.
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Okay. I was going to ask, do you have a link where like we can follow you so that when you do the seed dates and stuff like that, we'll know about them early?
Yes, ma'am. Most of that we put on our Facebook page, Savannah River Archaeological Research Program.
Mm-hmm.
We post all that stuff pretty update. Are we going to start the Instagram stuff, Haley? Yes, we're going to start an Instagram, so we'll get all that out there. You know, we like shovels.
Me too.
Not computers. so we have to pull ourselves sometimes to the 20th century, but no, we try to get all that stuff out the best we can so everybody knows what we're doing, when we're doing. You can certainly email me, Wingard, WINGARD @sc.edu, and I can get you emails for that stuff. So, any other questions?
Yeah, we got cards up all over. AK over here in the corner. I think yours was up first.
AK Hassan Cab. I was just curious, do you have a process set up whereby if certain discoveries are made and may have some description of what those discoveries might be, that they might be turned to a family or something, or is it kind of like a finders, keepers, owners, whatever process, or is there actually a process where you all have returned some things of value maybe to a family, but not otherwise?
Okay, so I think I'm thinking the question is any of the artifacts we found on the Savannah River site, do we ever return them back to the family? I think that sounds like the question. The property was purchased, in 1950 from the family. So everything on site, all the artifacts are property of the federal government. That's all the artifacts. So anything we find is US DOE property, federal government property. So we don't return anything per se. We do tours on occasion. We bring the family members out and allow them to visit their home sites. You got to remember that announcement was November 28th, 1950. So we're coming up, well, we just had the 70th anniversary. So family members that can and will come out, obviously they're the ones that can remember, they're pushing in their 80s now, 80s and 90s. So that group of first generation is getting smaller and smaller. But we do allow tours to come back out. We do share, again, through dissemination of reports and things of what we do find. But as far as returning artifacts, that's just something that, again, most everything we find is rusty nails, things like that. Probably, the Native American stuff, obviously, Native American, but most of the stuff we find historically is just, bottles, nails, broken glass, things like that. So,
Can I just do one follow-up?
Sure.
That would be in regards to, since you mentioned that many of the people are still living in the elderly ages, if you find something that's significant that they can provide relevant, historical, significant information regarding that artifact, et cetera, do you try to establish a relationship to get that historical process in place and give them some credit for their contribution to that?
Oh, most definitely. I have been going, I've worked here on site for 30 years, and I've been, the towns of Dunbarton and Ellington in particular, they have a reunion every year. Dunbarton's reunion is the first Sunday in May, and Ellington's is the second Sunday in June. I've been going to those reunions for almost 30 years myself, so I know so many of the former residents, and yes, there's been a lot of times where we found something, and we will call them on the phone and say, matter of fact, one of our volunteers, Mr. George Heath, lived in a small community called Hawthorne that I mentioned a moment ago. He comes out every Tuesday. Mr. Heath is 88 years old. And there's been a lot of times where we've had an artifact out and we don't know what it is. And Mr. Heath will come in on Tuesday and walk in the room, and he'll walk back out and he'll go, "Where did you find the step to that wagon at?" That was actually one of our artifacts. We had no clue what it was, but he knew exactly what it was. We have another lady, Miss Margaret Roundtree, who's from Dunbarton. And this lady, if I let her come back and live in a tent in Dunbarton, she would do it today. She would live there. She loves it. She loves coming back. But she is encyclopedic when it comes to the history of the site, the history of Dunbarton, as well as some of the artifacts she has in her collection. So most definitely, we utilize that resource as much as we can. A couple of the books you saw up here, the Reminiscences of Ellington, Reminiscences of Dunbarton, were two oral history books that we did with the residents back in the early 90s. And several of my films that I've done, the Hawthorne film, Mart to Art, Return to Dunbarton, a couple of others, are interviews with the former residents to tell us about that specific research that is relative to the films I'm working on. So most definitely, they're, as long as I can have them as a resource, it's a great thing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Jim, right over here.
Jim Gailcap. How many people do you have on staff, and typically how many volunteers would you have at any given time?
Wow, our staff. We have a pretty large staff. We have 7. We have 7 people right now. We were at 9 prior to COVID, and we've lost a couple, so we're in the process of rehiring. Volunteers, again, pre-COVID, we had 6, and we're down to 1. So we're looking hopefully to reestablish all of that, but COVID kind of brought us to our knees. But we hope to get all that built back up. But what we have in our office is we have several archaeologists. We have a couple of curators. We've had Miss Haley not only is our outreach coordinator, but she's our assistant curator just for the artifacts that are still coming in by the crew that's going out. So, but yeah, we have 7 folks.
Okay, thank you.
Can you dig a shovel test? I can hire you. Oh, we're going to go with Ms. Raina. Okay.
Narinder?
Narendra Malik. At SRS, have you found any prehistoric animals or plants? And if you did, have you done the carbon dating, and have they been classified into their specific biological orders?
That's a good question. Have we found it? We had an archaeologist just left us recently, but he's still very close to I mean, he didn't go far. So we still have access to his expertise. That was one of the things he was actually looking at. So the research he was working on, which was really fascinating, was at one of the Carolina bays. And while there, we actually found a couple of Clovis Points. Now, Clovis Points are the earliest spear points in North America. We're talking 13 to 15,000 years ago were these spear points. So his research was, we found these, do not touch them. So we got them out of the ground without touching them, or with our hands, and sent them off for blood residue. And so his research lended to the fact that he found what I believe, if I'm not mistaken, was cow blood. Now, that being said, there were no cows running around 13,000 years ago, but we did have prehistoric bison. So the evidence tends to show with that blood residue from that Clovis Point was that at least we knew there was a bison out there. Ducks. One of the other things he was looking at around the Flamingo Bay was gastroliths. Gastroliths are the stones that ducks will swallow. It gets caught in their craw and it helps them to digest their food. We found a lot of gastroliths kind of deep down. So obviously they were hunting around this bay for ducks, wildfowl, and things like that. So, without question, I can say it appears that at least we know there was bison and ducks. Ducks have always been around, so we've got ducks. But he was hovering on the fact that, I'll just put it this way because I think he was still working on his research and it was kind of ambivalent at the time. They were looking at some of the blood residue and comparing it to elephant. So we're going to kind of leave it there. So we know there were no elephants running around out there, but we know what could have been running around out there. So there's a chance there may have been a mastodon running around out there. So he's still working on that. So
a question I asked was, because SRS has a lot of diversity in plants and animal species, and I thought because it's a prehistoric site, there may be some artifacts, maybe Indians killed some animals and they got buried there, or they were using some plants as a food. So that's the reason I asked you a question.
No, you're absolutely right. It's the evidence for Native Americans is clearly there. To be lucky enough to come down something like a cooking area is going to be rare. We have found what we know to be trash pits. So we know that early Native Americans were eating turtles. We know some of the birds they were, because they, just like everybody else, they didn't just leave there. They would dig a hole and that's where their trash would go. So we have found some evidence of those types of areas. A couple of years ago, we actually found a cache of points. There were 11 or 14 really nice long spear points that we found. They were all together in one spot. And so we've been doing residue on those. We haven't got that evidence back. But what it looks like was, the best way to describe what it really looked like was someone had these probably in a leather bag, a leather skin, left them, dropped them, forgot about them, and that's where they stayed until we found them 14,000 years later, all 11, 14 of them together. So it's real rare, but it's real. We don't like to say luck. We like to say that it's our expertise, but for the most part, it's luck that if we can come down on something that can really give us something as spectacular as that. So, thank you.
We'll come back around over here. Greg?
Greg Murray, CAB. Thank you very much for an interesting presentation. So I've got a question. You'd mentioned that when a project is proposed on site, it's circulated to everybody else involved in all the other agencies and such on site.
Yes, sir.
What happens when a proposed project for environmental protection or cleanup clashes with one of your cultural projects and preservation projects?
What we do is we've been fairly lucky in that most of those they can actually shift the footprint a little bit for us. We've had that happen a few times. Now, there has been a few places where work was requested, but because of the layers we have out there and we know what's there in places, that sometimes we have to write a site off. that happens occasionally, be it maybe an old bridge or an old home site, but if it's fallen into an area that we can't access safely, if it falls in some of those areas. But we've been very lucky in that a lot of the sites, for example, where we found the Dave jar, for example, they were going to put a monitoring well right on top of the farmstead where the jar was found. And we actually worked with them, and they moved it about 300 feet up the road. So we were able to work with them. Of course, one of the largest projects that unfortunately we couldn't, or fortunately, was the MOX facility. There was a large woodland site there, and that had to be mitigated. So we had a couple of years to go in and excavate before MOX was built. And of course, now MOX is sitting on top of that. But, that was a necessity that needed to be done. And so we were able to go in and extrapolate that information prior to the building of the MOX facility. So.
That's interesting. How many sites do U.S. historical cultural sites are on the site?
We have approximately, if I'm not mistaken, the last number I heard was, I believe it was around 2,700 archaeological sites on the SRS.
And you talk about having to write some of them off. How often do you have to write a site? How often do you lose sites?
Very infrequently. Very infrequently.
Okay.
Very infrequently.
Like every 5 years infrequently or every 20 years infrequently?
I would actually say probably about every 3 years or so. Just one will come up. It'll be a site that we wouldn't go in. For example, there was a bridge recently that it was a dam bridge on Lower Three Runs. Archaeologically, we're not going to go into the floodplain area just because of some of the work that took place early in the site's history. So we would not go in and dig in a floodplain area. So that bridge was something that we were able to go in. We had land acquisition records. We had photos of it. We were able to take a few photos of it, accessing it from a road. We were able to do everything we needed. We sent a report to the South Carolina Historic Preservation Office to let them know what we were doing, but due to some of the logistics of doing anything archaeologically prior to the early 1950s, contaminants and whatnot that would have run through the floodplain, we couldn't go in. So that was a site that we just said, we've got to let this one go for those. But at the same time, it had been extensively written up by the Corps of Engineers, what it was, how much the land, the family was paid for it, and what we could do to it without getting into the floodplain, what we could do to protect it also.
Very interesting. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're quite welcome.
Any other questions or comments from around the table? Seeing none. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me. I certainly appreciate it. We're going to leave here till after everything's said and done.
Man, that's brave. Delisa, you think we can be trusted with that? I know. I tell you what I was going to do. We are running a little bit quick, so we do have some time. So I want to give you the option. We could take a break now, give you a chance to come and look at the Dave pot, and we can set George free, or we can keep plugging on. What do you guys want to do?
See the pot.
See the pot? Take a break? All right, let's take about 15 minutes. I'll call y'all back in, okay? Thank you.
Straight out. Right, I'm sorry.
They were
A break?
all right. We moving some stuff.
No, he was letting everybody come to the pot so they could, split archaeology.
Yeah, my husband works with it.
I've seen that pot multiple times.
I'm about to become a junior archaeologist. You take over my picture and I'll take yours. Please be very careful.
You like cookie baby?
Oh, I'm sure. Well, I try to balance it with coffee. I'm not a coffee drinker, so did.
And I can drink coffee too.
I cut it. Yes, ma'am. I cut it. Thank you. It's not the color I want, but.
put it back together.
They did. They found it in trash pile, and so they found as much as they could. But it had been broken. It was. Yeah, at the time. I think it's staying out. Come on, Jim. Yeah, we're gonna take a picture. I'll be right with you. One more. Okay. Wait, are we looking? Oh, you're supposed to? Okay.
I'm good. Okay, looks like we're gonna get out of here a little early today. Have you seen, you've seen that before though, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you gonna be able to make it to Columbia?
Yeah, yeah. This time at least Rob will.
What is it anyway? Because we seem to always be on the road.
What is it?
Really? More vacation.
Yeah, it's just like a pot.
And Rob does have like
I don't know.
They found the part of the site?
Yeah, well, yeah, and it was like in pieces, and so they like put it back together. Yeah.
how much photos.
So it's just like really old, like from, 1850, I think.
He's amazing. He's such a good speaker. He can engage with
Right. Well, I know that's what, when he was coming up, and I was just telling, telling him that, that he's more interested in presenter because it's like, it's all fun. Yeah, I know.
Narendra, is Phyllis coming to town or she out of town? Phyllis coming to town or she out of town? Oh, I live north. I'm sorry. But I've always since college wanted to do archaeological digs, so I'm about to follow.
Maybe that's what that was for.
That's the highlight. This one woke me up. I was sleeping. This just woke me up. How about they took my sandwiches when I was gone?
Yeah, I hope you
Okay, that just means I didn't need to eat. That's fine. I told Jay
I didn't realize how much
I know you spend the night, but I got work to do at home. I got a whole laundry list of stuff that I probably ain't gonna do, but at least I wrote it down.
So that actually helped.
I'm ahead
sitting on it this past,
Oh, Lord, I had just went outside.
and it was like they had, like, you chose the lane, not through Columbia, or you chose the lane for the exit.
Charlie, 4th of July.
If that's the case, I need to do something. I said, James, we had a restaurant in Jimmy. We getting out, we need to go home. Cause I got some stuff to do. I've been gone for 2 weeks solid, except for, 2 weeks solid. I did a week at so I had 1 day at home, Wednesday at home in Charles. And then my week today. The very next day, Sunday, so it's just been busy, but I'm about to take me a couple of days off. Not work. I don't know. No, we're going to Alabama.
Tomorrow.
Oh, we're going to Charleston Friday. And then we're going to Atlanta, Alabama. For the weekend. We helped with the International Museum, and we were part of the 200 Denmark Beast Gang. And so my husband left his mom's quilt down there, and he has to get it from the museum. So it'll be a more relaxed day. And then a friend of mine who has autoimmune, they have an immune system. He's taking her on a tour. He takes groups of tours. She can't go. I got so much comp time with all this work. I just had government, South Carolina government school science. And I'm so proud of Orange. They got kids now. One person has a profession. Two schools. So Melinda like no, two.
Oh, yeah,
yeah, but we got kids who are in their program. They all look like us.
It's a gift.
And which is huge because even Aiken. Whoever started it then, they finished out the past year. Which is the longest. Right. So I traveled the whole state. At the last board meeting. No, the day I had to ask you to have one. I had just come from somewhere concerning the yeah, but the week before that, days before that, like that Friday, I just finished the week of the country. I need I enjoy it, but I'm glad I got confirmation today.
I mean, that's a big deal.
This will be one of my things that's big enough to do.
Well.
And I told what I called Wayne was remember to give me that message out of my own connection.
My son moved into an apartment.
I think that's my
So
I have those ideas on the it's not far, but
Right, okay. Yeah, and the other thing is,
Springfield Baptist Church is across from
I don't know.
They went out there. It should be in the newspaper. Wayne, they went out
I
there
know we did the box lunch
while I was at another camp. Wayne from home. So they have a big show in the
hands off, like, here's your box, take your box, nobody's touched your stuff.
They can't buy them in LA. You want to take a picture about them? Okay.
No.
I just took the supply. Who supplied this? You want that?
I don't know. I don't know, but I'm just thinking like.
I'm not sitting at Wayne. You think he don't want to I don't see why you got this.
Oh, yeah, right.
I myself, I'm with my own hand.
That's what I'm going to talk about Wednesday.
I've always been interested in archaeology.
That was
I just never have been. I don't think I've ever been a dig. Really,
I mean,
in the U.S., in South
to
Carolina,
have, like, there was nothing to drink. Like, and not everybody drinks juice.
I don't know if the man's still living or not, but you can go and do, pay money, take a butt, take a
So,
pig.
I'm gonna say something about the fair.
All kinds of stuff. I need to find out
I
about that,
wanna
because I
know
took kids there one time.
You know, like,
But,
what are we
I'm
doing?
sending this to him, but he's not really well.
You know, we're gonna have coffee, and we're gonna have bottled water, and
When I was still working at the site, I did that camp. I did that camp.
but still,
So I've been
just
an instructor for campus for
because I know, like she said, anything about.
And then when I was hired, first year I didn't teach, the second year I did a year at South State, and the next year.
Anyway, it just wasn't, it wasn't good.
But I'm not doing that today. It's very, you know what it is? The same thing that happens in a big place. Very
That's why I'm really interested in, wanting to go.
Trying to act like a product. So, we'll see. I got other things to do outside of the But our,
I probably could,
I think this year, more than ever,
yeah, I don't know, probably not. Yeah, probably not, probably not. I do like money, yeah, I do, but no, oh, I could be like a subcontractor, no, I think that there's something, I know, like to become a cab member, right, you can't just have, you have to have a few years before, you like work for someplace and stuff, but, I know it's
Well,
gonna
we
be
should
weird.
be almost done, too. We just have to discuss the recommendations.
And so, like my.
Get the heck out of here. And then we meet tomorrow at 9, huh?
I think so. Current, more, yeah.
Oh, I was the publisher of my hometown newspaper in Ohio. called the Jackson Telegram. It was, the town was in 6,000 people. The entire county was
So,
maybe 36,000.
speaking of that, is everything okay?
So it's very small.
I mean, right.
Oh, yes.
So did you just like handpick just it's hard.
I might be back game for that. And don't be knowing as much as your toenail. You be like, what? Okay. Is it the meat room? No. Do I have to put it in the room? Williams? Oh, okay. Let me go back. Like I'm in the room.
Might be because
I want you to normally it's a Hill Honors guest thing, it's not popping up. I don't know what's going on. But I had connect. You know what? That just means I ain't supposed to be working. I'll try again. You know what? That's what that means. Because we hope we ain't gonna be here, but another. This right here. It shouldn't take that long. Let me not stay for that today.
All right, folks, I'll give you a 2-minute warning. Let's find our seats, and we will get started again. 2 minutes.
The last time.
Okay, thank you.
Something from her.
Our little process,
Okay.
it was great because it was the only paper.
But you have, they
people
have
would
all
write
that
just to keep up.
Okay.
I also managed the radio station. We had 3 FMs and an AM. Plus I had news. And the same guy owned them.
Yeah, let's get out of here.
So, yeah. So you just sold them all at once. You know, you
Can't what to get done today.
sell both.
Go by commercial lives and things like that.
It was a nice situation.
What did that be? Even if it is, some people don't want to tell you that.
from the office to the.
Let's bring it in.
That's right.
Up next on the agenda, we have public comment set aside. It's always a good time to do a little bit of public comment before we have some discussion. That way folks get the chance to have their voices heard, inputs on draft and whatnot. We have one person signed up to give a public comment, and that is former CAB member Lewis Walters. Mr. Walters, would you mind stepping up to the microphone, please?
Welcome to Augusta, guys. I'm a former CAB member, going back a number of years. Great presentation by George. I was just discussing or asking some questions regarding the potential African slave population in the area in regards to that. But you guys are thorough. Again, thank you for sending out those invitations. Keep them coming. All right, thank you.
Always. Do we have anyone else who wishes to make a public comment before we move on? We got a little bit of time left. Seeing none, we ready to go? We got some business to tend to today. How do we feel about that? Yay. Let's pick it up. Let's start with what is it? What's listed first on the agenda? Already walked away. Closing recommendation 370. So recommendation 370, I believe, went through FDSR. Or no, it didn't have a committee attached to it. That's right. This was during the COVID pandemic. Greg had an idea for a recommendation. He wrote this. The board approved it. It actually went to the chairs, all chairs meeting, where they also have been working on approving it. We're waiting on a broader response from the department for that. But Greg, can you give us a little bit of update as the author?
There we go. All righty, thank you, Greg Murray Cab. This was a recommendation that began in the middle of the pandemic, when there were a full 6 board members on the CAB. Part of it, it seemed like it was not just the result of the pandemic, but it was also the result of a very difficult approval process through DOE headquarters. After some discussion and frustration and consternation that our CAB basically could not legitimately operate and make decisions. There didn't seem to be much headway being made. So the CAB passed this recommendation that did eventually go on up to DOE. It came back. DOE SR, Savannah River, partially accepted it for reasons that are completely expected. And we knew that there were problems with it that could not be addressed locally, that had to be addressed at headquarters, DOE headquarters, and we expected, or at least I expected, the result we've got. DOE did respond, and it's up for consideration for closure at this meeting. So that would be my take on it, and I plan on voting to close it when we have that opportunity, if we get to that point.
So normally a full committee would actually recommend closure. In this case, it was passed by what was the entire board at the time, the 6 members that were around. So it's not attached to a committee. So we're going to have the actual discussion today to see if we need to talk about this a little bit more, see if there's any lingering thoughts. So I'm going to ask if there are any questions, comments, concerns about this recommendation and the DOE response from the board. AK.
Yes, assuming that, I'm on basis here, I was looking at the recommendation and the challenges that were addressed because of the size of the board, and we know some of it had to do with the pandemic that was ongoing. I would assume that other parts of it had to do with the changeover in administrations in Washington, D.C., and the time to appoint a representative to DOE and them to get their feet on the ground, look at, what was going on, and then assess and make their decisions in terms of reappointments, et cetera. And I think as a result of that process, my interpretation is that they decided that the the cab in this area needed to be more diverse. And so I'm just trying to understand how much of the dysfunction that is being described might have been as a result of the reorganization structure coming out of Washington in terms of further diversification of the committee.
It would be,
and if that's the case, then did we need to necessarily be critical of that process at all?
it would be extremely difficult to say that it had anything to do with the presidential transition at the time, because remember the election is in November, right? And so the appointments are in January. The package had already been with headquarters since, I want to say, early September, August, late August, early September, in that time frame. The transition doesn't happen, inauguration isn't until January 20th. Generally, a package is done by that time. It would be difficult to say it had anything to do with the transition at all. I could be wrong. I'm sure I'll get a phone call if I am, but it would be difficult to say that there's any blame that you can place on that.
When the directives came down regarding diversifying the board, in order to achieve those objectives, how long did that part of the process?
That one's a little bit, I mean, that's in the, so a lot of that discussion had to do with the next appointment cycle and not necessarily the one that was under consideration at the time.
Thank you.
Yeah, James, it did take us several months to go out and take action on that, diversifying the panel, identifying where we could recruit from, because our normal method, just advertising you could be on it wasn't sufficient to get the diversification we were looking for. So we had to go out and intentionally recruit something. I don't think we'd actually done exactly that way before, so it was a new environment for us. So it did take us some time to cycle up and get that done. I think in the end it was, although it was a long and painful process, in the end it was good for us to take that perspective and figure out how to do this better.
And beyond simple diversification, I mean, the recommendation itself wasn't a pushback against that. It's just what happens when you have a lapse. It's possible to do that. Other boards had had it over the years. They had periods where that happened. That had just never caught up with us in terms of a package being delayed for any reason. And when it did, Greg had this idea. This is how maybe it should be dealt with. Maybe there should be a method to do temporary appointments for a little while. So.
Can I ask one final question?
Yeah, of course.
Mr. Button, do you anticipate now with this new descriptive in terms of membership, now that that's in place, I assume that is it expected that cycle would go a lot smoother in the future?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah. I mean, you can never account for, the next change of administration, you change all the people, and they may come up with different ideas, but I think currently, pretty steady state, shouldn't really be an issue going forward as far as timing of getting these packages approved.
One of the things that they've done that you haven't had a chance to hear about is they put some guardrails in place. So the whole package is due on the same timeline, but they actually want a preview package to do a pre-approval for. So our 2023 slate of nominees, Ike White has already taken a look at. And a lot of folks up at headquarters have already taken a look at, even though the official package isn't going to go in for a couple months. And that's just so that they have the chance to give feedback during a time period where we can course correct if we need to. So there's some guardrails put in place on the process now that definitely help out with that. Any other questions or comments, concerns? So if we move forward with closing with this, does anybody have any feelings, some unanswered questions before they know how to vote? Everybody knows how they want to vote on closing this one? I'm not seeing any objections, but I am seeing some nods, so I'm good with that. I want to give you one last chance. Going once, going twice. Okay. let's move on to our next bit of business, and this is the draft recommendation about proof of implementation of recommendations accepted by the Department of Energy. So if we could pull that down, yep, and pull up that one. Now this one, there's a couple of edits that came in this morning, very minor from what you have in your handouts. This one was written by Narendra, Jim, and Katrina. Who wants to talk to it? Narendra? You want to tell us about this one, this draft?
Narendra Malakab. Greg did a survey and submitted it at Columbia executive meeting that showed that within the last 5 years, CAB members submitted about 105 recommendations, and out of that, about 30% were accepted, about 35% were partially accepted, and remaining were rejected. So our question was, that whatever the recommendations have been accepted and partially accepted, how they are being implemented. We were, over the 5 years, we are still in dark. So that's the recommendation we recommend submitting, that DOE prepare an annual report summarizing the status of all accepted and partially accepted items and any recommendation item completed during the period. So that's our recommendation. We would like to be informed how they are being implemented, and if there is a deviation, that should also be mentioned in that.
All right, so everyone got a draft of this in their email about 2 weeks ago. You'll notice there were some changes. You should have gotten the updated copy about a week ago that reflects more what you're seeing now. So hopefully everybody looked at the attachments in the reminder that went out last week and went, ooh, I need to reread all those. Any questions or comments about this draft recommendation? How do we feel about the text, about the recommendation itself? Are there any thoughts anybody would like to share? I get really confused when y'all talk all at the same time. You're going to have to tell my kids, one at a time, please. Greg?
James, thank you. Greg Murray, CAB. I very much support this recommendation. I personally think this is probably one of the most important, if not the most important, recommendation I will be involved with during my time on the CAB. I think this is about accountability. It's about showing that what we do matters. It's very easy for people to say they will do stuff and then follow-up is not always there. I think DOE is pretty good about that, but we also want to make sure that we're aware of how and when things are being implemented. And I think this recommendation is a big step in that way. And as I said, I do plan on supporting it when we do finally vote on it. Thank you. And thank you, Narendra, Jim, and Katrina for your work on this.
Any other thoughts from around the table? So are we all good with this? Do we know how we're going to vote tomorrow? People generally have a good feel for what you want to do? Seeing some head nods? How about on this side of the room? Yeah? Okay. Mike? Yeah, go for it.
Hey, Greg, I agree with you. I don't usually comment on your recommendations in advance, but, I haven't been here 5 years yet, and you're asking to go back 5 years in history. I may have undone something that we agreed to do. I don't know. So, we change out the leadership here and personnel all the time, and if we don't do something like this, we don't maintain that corporate history. So we know what we agreed to do, and if we were going to make a change, then we ought to be talking to you about it if we're going to make a change to something we agreed before. So I think this is a great idea.
All right. Any other thoughts? Give you one last chance. We're solid with the wording as is? Really? When's the last time that happened, Charles? Phyllis isn't here. I'm going to tell her you said that. All right, let's move on to the last one on our agenda. We're flying today. Prepare the required regulatory decommissioning documents in parallel with the deactivation process. This is a 2-line title. It's got all the words. All right. Stephanie, will you scroll down a little bit? Yeah, that section right there, that's the part that we're going to care about the most, I think.
James, in this recommendation, the last paragraph, SRS currently has approximately, I think somebody was supposed to provide the number access facilities.
Oh, will you scroll up a little bit? I'm sorry. I said that that bottom one's going to be the most important. Oh, the X's, yeah. We just need to get the numbers from Avery. She still owes me that, and I owe her an harassing email about it. But we're going to fill that in. We'll fill in those X's before we actually post this online, and we'll get the actual number on that. So this one was written by Greg and Phyllis, and Greg, you've done a lot of talking today. I would turn it over to Phyllis, but she's not here, so you're going to have to tell us about this one as
So I'm
well.
going to have to be the champion for this.
You
All right,
are.
Here we go. All right, yes, it is a long title. We thought, what the heck, it's appropriate, so we'll give it a shot. So anyhow, thank you all for your attention on this. What this recommendation recognizes is first that the deactivation and decommissioning process is a two-step process. And what it's basically, when you boil this down, it in essence says, let's try to do as many of both steps at the same time as we can in order to shorten the deactivation and decommissioning process. Excuse me. So that's what this is about. Primarily, it is as the deactivation process is being pursued, there's a bunch of regulatory work, paperwork, and approvals and such that need to be done. And the recommendation is to try to do as many of those as can be done during the deactivation process. As I recall from the last meeting when this was talked about, I think the estimates were that this could cut the D&D time anywhere from, I think they said 6 months up to a year and a half. So as part of the idea of reducing risk and money, that's a big chunk of time to be cutting from the process. So that's what this recommendation is about.
And there was a precedence for this, right? The board did a similar recommendation for 235F.
Yes, the original idea, at least coming to Phyllis and me, was the recommendation regarding 235F. There was some desire, I don't know if urgency is the right word, there was a desire to move the process along quickly, and this was the process that was adopted for the D&D of 235F. And what essentially we've done is lifted that process and put it in a recommendation and said, well, why don't we do this on as many different D&D projects as we can. And if you'll notice in the first paragraph, it identifies very specifically the type of projects that it would apply to.
So, any questions, comments, concerns? Narinder, you are itching to go. Ready?
James,
What do you got for us?
This recommendation was approved by the committee and it's supposed to go for the vote now.
Well, we always give the board a chance to discuss first. We don't just go straight into voting.
Okay.
So we got to give everybody a chance to look at it and read, and that's what we're doing today. The vote will be tomorrow. Any questions, comments, concerns about the draft, about the language in the background, or even better, the recommendation section itself? Any questions?
Can I just make I guess just for clarification, because the recommendation talks specifically about nuclear facilities, HAZCAT 2 or 3, radiological facilities, and high-hazard chemical facilities, and the number on the front, the X's, that's a different number of facilities. So you might want to,
Clarify that so that
yeah,
it reads approximately.
It's a lot of excess facilities. That number's not going to equal the specific facilities you're talking about back here.
Okay.
Am I right, Angela? Do you understand what I'm saying? Okay.
Yeah. So we'll need to make that change so that it reads, instead of just excess facilities, the number will be the number of those.
Or just, yeah, it's not going to be, I don't want anybody to assume that the large number in the background session is going to equal those facilities that are in the actual recommendation.
Okay.
My understanding is that at the subcommittee meeting in last month, somebody has mentioned that these information will be provided.
Yes, it's owed to me. We'll get the information.
Okay.
Any other questions, comments, concerns about this?
James, regarding Amy's comment,
Yeah.
maybe for the X number to be filled in the back, if we could get a count of, and maybe this is what you're suggesting, Amy, we get the count that would apply to the HAZCAT 2 or 3.
Yep.
And then stick that in there so as not to create confusion.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's what we'll do. Any other thoughts? So are we good with this? We're going to make that change. We're going to make that update overnight. We'll change the X's, hopefully in the numbers overnight, and we'll change that to apply specifically to the types of facilities listed in the recommendation section. Beyond that change, is there anything else that we need to talk about with this? Does everyone know how they plan to vote tomorrow? Does anyone need more information before they vote tomorrow? Charles, you know what you want to do? Okay. Charles knows. Anything else before we move on? I know exactly where it is. Thank you for the... All right, well, that concludes our board business for the day. Before we move on to closure, if you noticed, Heather wasn't able to be with us this afternoon. She had some things that she needed to attend to at home. I want to thank Ms. Stephanie Cumberland from the Office of External Affairs for driving in to helping us out today. I appreciate it very much. She got an email from me at 6:39 this morning saying, hey, you remember when you offered to help? And she got in the car and drove out here. She lives in Barnwell, so it was quite the haul. Thank you, Stephanie. Blackville? Oh. I was almost there. So, all right. Anything else? Greg, do you have some closing words before we recess?
Yeah, well, just real quick, are we having an A&O meeting after this?
We are in the room
right.
across the hall. Administrative and Outreach Committee members, if you'll gather across the hall, please.
Okay, otherwise, thank you all. Thank you, presenters today. Thank you, CAB members, for your attention. Thank you for all the DOE folks and staff and everybody who's here. We are recessed, and I'll see y'all tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Is that correct?
9 a.m.
9 a.m. Be here, be square.
Thanks all.
They don't realize that it's age group.
About an hour and 10 minutes.
It used to be 9:30, then for 5 years they changed.